We have been talking a bit about percents and estimating with percents, but it's also important that we understand that percents, since they're a way of showing part of a whole, that percents can also be changed into fractions and decimals, and vice versa. Decimals and fractions can be changed into percents. So that's going to be the focus of what we're working on today. So let's think about this just for a minute. If I give you a fraction of 3/8 and ask you to change it to a decimal, we already know how to do this. So this part's going to be a review. We can do 3 divided by 8. And when we work that out, remember we have to annex a decimal and a 0. We're going to get 375 thousandths. So 3/8 equals 375 thousandths. So the way that we change a fraction to a decimal, we already know we do when we have a numerator over a denominator. We already know that we do the numerator divided by the denominator. So for example, with our 3/8, we did 3 divided by 8. Now what we're doing right here is just a graphic organizer, a way to remember how to do this. So notice my arrow. This is for changing a fraction to a decimal. So those directions we just wrote were how to change a fraction to a decimal. Now we also have a 3/10 here as a decimal, and if we want to change that to a fraction, we learned how to do that. We read, write, reduce. So 3/10, we put a 1 under the decimal, 0 under each place after. It equals 3/10. This one cannot be simplified, so we're done. But we can add some notes here and say, well, the way that we would change a fraction to a decimal, or a decimal to a fraction rather, the way that we would do that, I'm going to put my directions here along this arrow. We read, write, and reduce. Now, that brings us then to percents and where those fit into this. Now remember that percents are out of 100, are always out of 100. So the next thing I might look at is and say, oh, wait a minute, and say I know how to do that, is if I have 24%, I probably know how to change that to a fraction. So 24% changed to a fraction, 24% means 24 out of 100. Well, 24 out of 100 can be simplified because I can divide both 24 and 100 by 4 to get 6/25. So 24% equals 6/25. So one way that I can change a percent to a fraction, so this is kind of going all the way around. One way that I can change a percent to a fraction is I can put the percent over 100. I can always put the percent over 100, and that's going to be what my fraction is going to be. And then, of course, I always should simplify as well. All right, so let's look at some other things here. What if I want to change a decimal to a percent? Well, we know again that percents are out of 100. We can think about the fraction, what fraction it makes, changing that fraction to a percentage, and things like that. So for example, we can know that this 3/10 as a decimal, we can know that that means the fraction 3/10, which really means 30 out of 100. Remember, percents have to be out of 100. So we can do this right here to come up with an equivalent fraction that is out of 100. And so then 30 would be my percentage. 30%. But I want to show you there really is a shortcut for how we can do that. So let's take a minute and see if we can see that shortcut. If you look at all of these decimals, you can see what percentages they would equal. So pause for just a minute and see if you can see what the shortcut is for how to change a decimal to a percent. All right, so if you looked closely at these, hopefully the pattern you noticed is I'm always just moving the decimal twice to the right. So 24 hundredths equals 24%. 95 hundredths equals 95%. 3/10 equals, I have to put a 0 in this empty spot, equals 30%. So I'm moving the decimal 2 places to the right. 8 hundredths equals 8%. 376 thousandths equals 37 6/10%. 2 3/10 equals 230%. And yes, it is possible to have percentages that are greater than 100%. So I always have to move the decimal exactly 2 places to the right in order to change a decimal to a percent. So I can add that to my notes up here. To change a decimal to a percent, I am simply going to move the decimal 2 places to the right, always. Now, it probably then should make sense to you how we change a percent to a decimal. So if we want to change a percent to a decimal, let's look at some examples of that. These are some percents and the decimals that they equal. Pause and see if you can figure out how to change them, and then we'll move on and see if you're correct. All right, if you did these correctly, it's all about the position of the decimal. So if you did this correctly, the 3 6/10 and the 67 3/10 percents already had decimals in them, so I don't need to put those there. But I moved 2 places to the left. That's going to give me 85 hundredths. 2 places to the left gives me 63 hundredths. 2 places to the left gives me 2 15 hundredths. 2 places to the left gives me 7 hundredths, because I have to annex that 0. 2 places to the left gives me 36 thousandths. 2 places to the left gives me 673 thousandths. So the rule is always to move twice to the left. So when I look at this, if I want to change a decimal, or a percent to a decimal rather, I'm always going to move my decimal 2 places to the left. Now, you're going to say, ooh, it's going to be hard to know which way to move it. Well, for one thing, just thinking about it and the values and thinking about what makes sense will help you. But also, think about looking at this chart and kind of picture it in your head. I call it the FDP chart, F for fraction, D for decimal, P for percent. To go from a decimal to a percent, you're always going to the right. Percent to decimal is always to the left. So that's a way you can remember. And it's always 2 places. All right, so let's look at a couple more things here in our chart. So looking at our chart here, then 24% has to equal, move our decimal 2 places to the left, 1, 2, has to equal 24 hundredths. That makes sense because it matches our 24 hundredths we got for our fraction as well. Now, what about if we want to change the fraction 3/8 to a percentage? Well, there's a few ways we can do it. We can change it to that decimal, 375 thousandths, and we can take that decimal answer and move the decimal twice to the right, and that's going to give us 37 5/10%. We can definitely do that. What we can also do is, if we know that percents have to be out of 100, then we can say, well, 3/8, 3 out of 8 would be how much out of 100? And then the missing number is going to be our percentage. Remember, we cross multiply and divide to solve that if we can't see an easy scale factor. So I would do 100 times 3 and then divide by 8. 100 times 3 is 300. 300 divided by 8 is 37 and 5/10. So we would get still 37 and 5/10 over 100, which would be then 37 and 5/10%. So to finish out our notes on how we change back and forth between fractions, decimals, and percents, if I want to change from a fraction to a decimal, notice I could definitely do the 2 steps and go from the fraction to the decimal and then the decimal to the percent, but I could also shortcut it and go straight from the fraction to the percent. And the way I would do that is I would make it a fraction out of 100. So whatever my numerator and denominator are, I have to change it so that it's a percentage out of 100. So for example, with our 3/8, we would say 3/8 equals what number out of 100. That's a way that we could do that. And then we just cross multiply and divide to solve it. So let's look at a few examples. Specifically, I want to look at a few examples of changing a fraction to a percentage because I think that tends to be where people struggle the most, is changing a fraction to a percentage. Changing between decimals and percents is fairly easy because it's all about just moving the decimal, but changing between fractions and percents is a little bit harder. But again, I would suggest always, you can change them to a decimal and then a percent, but it might even be easier to say, well, it always has to be out of 100, and then the numerator is my percentage. So I can use a scale factor on this one. 25 times 4 is 100. 8 times 4 is 32. So that means 8/25 equals 32%. Now, if I wanted to check that, I could say, well, percents are always out of 100, so 32% means 32 out of 100. Does 32 out of 100 simplify to 8/25? Yeah, it does, because I just divide by 4, both top and bottom. All right, 5/8. So for this one, again, I want to have it out of 100. I would just do 5 times 100, so cross multiply and then divide by 8. 5 times 100 is 500. 500 divided by 8 is 62 and 5/10. So we get 62 and 5/10 out of 100, which means 5/8 equals 62 and 5/10%. And last but not least, 2 and 3/5. So this one, as a percentage, we have to recognize, first of all, that 2 wholes, each whole is one whole is 100%. Think about this as like one whole circle. One whole circle is 100%. So 2 wholes would be 200%. So this is 200%, but then I also need to add in whatever the 3/5 is. So 3/5 would equal 60/100. So that's going to be 60%. So this part is 60%. So the total is 260%. If that's a little like, I don't know about that to you, then we could change the 2 and 3/5 into an improper fraction, which would be 13/5. And 13/5 would be 5 times 20 is 100. 13 times 20 is 260. So 13/5 would still be 260 out of 100, which would be 260%, no matter which way you look at it. All right, let's take a moment and try just a couple of these, changing the decimals to percents and the percents to decimals as well. Take a moment and look at these. Remember, it's all about moving the decimal. Pause while you try it, and then when you're finished, hit play and see if you're correct. All right, again, it's all about moving those decimals. So 1, 2. It moves 2 places to the left, change a percent to a decimal. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. So my percentages, my decimals here are going to be 23/100ths, 8/100ths, 9/10ths, which is the same as 90/100ths. So if I had that 0 after it, that would be okay too. 2 and 47/100ths, and 92 thousandths. And then changing our decimals to percents, we have to move the decimal the other way, 2 places to the right. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. And so 5 hundredths equals 5%, 6 tenths equals 60%, 2 and 9 tenths equals 290%, 7 hundredths equals 7%, 386 thousandths equals 38 and 6 tenths percent. Notice that when I change a decimal to a percent, I do have to put a percent sign on the end. When I change a percent to a decimal, I do have to take that percent sign off of the end of it. So pay attention to that as well. So the big key idea is when we're changing between decimals and percents, we always move the decimal 2 places, no more and no less. And the reason for that is because basically what we're always doing is either multiplying or dividing by 100. And multiplying by 100 moves the decimal twice to the right. Dividing by 100 moves the decimal twice to the left. So knowing that, percents are out of 100, there's 2 zeros in 100, that can also remind you 2 places is how far you have to move your decimal when you're changing between decimals and percents. And the direction, remember what I told you about the FDP. Decimal to percent goes to the right, and percent to decimal goes to the left.